Okay, well, let's move on to learning goal number 2. What is interesting about the biology of mosquitoes? Now, if I could answer this learning goal with a single word, it would be everything. So mosquito biology is something that I find quite fascinating, and it's actually the primary focus of my research program at The Ohio State University. I hope you're going to soon share my enthusiasm and understand why I think they are so interesting from a basic biological perspective. Now, as we have seen for all the other fly groups we've covered so far, mosquitoes have a holometabolous life cycle, meaning that they undergo a complete metamorphosis. Similar to the black flies we learned about in Module 6, the mosquito life cycle utilizes both aquatic and terrestrial habitats to complete their life cycle. The eggs, larvae, and pupae are aquatic organisms, whereas the adults are terrestrial. So now let's go into more detail on the aquatic life stages, starting with their eggs. The eggs of mosquitoes can vary in anatomy depending on the species, and they often have unique adaptations. For example, the eggs of Anopheline species, one of which you see pictured here, are often laid individually by mosquitoes and possess air-filled floats that keep them at the surface of the water column. The red arrow in this figure is pointing out where those air-filled floats are, which are translucent in appearance. In contrast to the eggs of Anopheles species, the eggs of Culex species are laid together in clumps that form free-floating rafts that will stay on the water surface, or they can attach to aquatic plants. On the other hand, the eggs of Aedes species of mosquitoes are laid individually on a moist substrate near the water-air interface. Now, in some species of Aedes, including the primary vector of Zika virus, the eggs must first desiccate or dry out before they can hatch upon the next rainfall. So their life cycle is often tied to the ebbs and flows of rainwater. The image below shows you some Aedes eggs, which are within this black rectangle, that have been laid near the water's edge. So this reflection here shows you the edge of the water, which would be to the left. And you can see that the eggs are laid on a moist substrate on the edge. And this moist substrate will soon dry out along with the eggs. And then after the next rainfall, when the water levels rise, those larvae will hatch out of the eggs. And here you can see a close-up of what the eggs of a typical Aedes species look like. After the eggs are laid, larvae will usually hatch or emerge about 1 to 2 days later. An exception may be an Aedes species that requires the eggs to first desiccate, in which case the time to hatching can be a little more unpredictable. Regardless, the larvae that emerge are highly active swimmers, often referred to as wigglers or wrigglers. The larvae typically feed on organic matter and microorganisms in the water column, so they do not pose any direct threat to human or animal health when they're in the larval life stage. They can use their mouth parts to generate water currents and filter food, or to scrape and shred food off of surfaces. At the larval stage, you can often distinguish Anopheline species from Culecine species by the presence or absence of a respiratory siphon. The respiratory siphon is indicated on this slide by the red arrows, and it is only found in Culecine species. The Anopheline species lack this siphon, as you can see from the example on the left. Now, interestingly, although larvae are aquatic organisms, they breathe air. And the way that they breathe air is by coming to the water surface, as you would see in the Anopheline species, and breathing through spiracles on the abdomen. Or in the case of the Culecine species, they can use that respiratory siphon to pierce through the water and breathe air. Thus, the larvae need to come to the water surface to breathe, and you can kind of think of them as snorkeling. And this is why some mosquito control treatments involve the spraying of oil on the water surface. And this essentially suffocates the larvae because they cannot break through that surface tension with the oil layer on top of the water. Now, this is not a foolproof control strategy because some mosquito species have actually evolved a very sharp respiratory siphon. And this is what you see on the right, highlighted by the red box. And this sharp piercing siphon allows them to pierce the air-filled stems of submerged aquatic vegetation. So some species of mosquito can breathe underwater without having to come to the surface by tapping into air in the stems of aquatic plants. So a pretty nifty adaptation. Now let's watch a brief video clip so that you can see some of these larvae or wrigglers in action. I'm going to pause the video here and the funky music, but what I want you to pay attention to is here you can see some coolocene larvae. There's the respiratory siphon piercing through the water to get to the air above, and you'll notice the mouth parts of the larvae vibrating around, really active, and this is them generating water currents so that they can filter food. So you'll see this when I start the video again. So you can see them pulsating those mouth parts, and that's the creating water currents to filter food out. And there you can see them, why they're called wrigglers, as they swim with that whole body undulating. And then you're getting a better view of those mouth parts, creating the water currents for allowing them to filter feed. As the larvae feed, they will grow in size, shedding their exoskeleton as they become larger and go through a total of 4 developmental stages that are also known as instars. This developmental process can be as short as a few days to as long as a few weeks, depending on the ambient temperature and the availability of food. Now, once the larvae complete the 4th instar, they will transform into pupa. The pupae are also known as tumblers, and you will see why we call them that in a video clip I'll show in a few minutes. Anatomically, pupae are quite distinct from larvae, and you can distinguish them easily by eye. On the right hand side, this figure shows you a pupa highlighted in the red box, and on each side of the pupa is a 4th instar larva. And you'll note that the pupa no longer has the respiratory siphon and is curled up in appearance versus the larvae, which tend to stretch out lengthwise. Now, in most cases, the pupae will float to the surface of the water and be right at that water-air interface. Breaking through that surface tension are so-called air trumpets, which are respiratory structures that allow them to breathe. So they're still breathing air while they're in this pupal stage. And notably, the pupae do not feed. They dedicate all of their resources into metamorphosis, so undergoing that transition into a terrestrial adult that we are most familiar with. And if left undisturbed, they will remain motionless at the surface of the water, as you see here. But if they're disturbed, if something flies over them, like a potential predator, then they will swim downward in the water column by doing somersaults, hence their common name of tumblers. And we're going to watch a brief video clip so that you can see these pupae in action.
The pupa breathes air through tubes called trumpets. No, not that kind. These trumpets pop through to the air above the water so the pupa can breathe. Pupa roll around through the water like a spaz, which is why people call them tumblers. Pretty funny looking, don't you think?
Well, I hope that video clip gives you an appreciation of why the pupal stages are called tumblers. And as I mentioned, while they're in this stage, they're primarily undergoing metamorphosis to transform into those terrestrial flying adults. But before we discuss the adults, I wanted to provide a brief overview of the range of aquatic habitats that mosquitoes can exploit, which is one of the reasons why they're so challenging to control. Now, in contrast to black flies, which we learned about in Module 6, where the eggs and larvae are found in fast-moving aquatic habitats such as rivers and streams, mosquitoes lay their eggs and their larvae develop in slow-moving or standing bodies of water. Usually these are freshwater habitats such as swamps, ponds, or lakes, as well as the rainwater that collects in tree holes. But some mosquitoes can tolerate saltier water, such as that found in salt marshes. Incredibly, there are even some mosquito species that have adapted to being able to live in the standing water that collects in pitcher plants. Pitcher plants are a type of carnivorous plant that collects water and attracts flying insects into this water, where it can then trap them and digest them. But in this case, we have some species of mosquitoes that lay their eggs and their larvae develop in that aquatic habitat. So they're able to withstand this noxious environment that the plant can digest other insects in. So an incredible adaptation that some mosquitoes have evolved to exploit what one would consider to be an off-limits aquatic environment. Now these are all natural environments or natural sources of standing water, but it's important to note that just about any source of standing water can serve as a potential habitat for larval mosquitoes, whether it's natural or human-derived. For instance, any object that collects rainwater can provide a potential aquatic habitat for mosquitoes to lay their eggs and their larvae to develop. And humans, unfortunately, are quite proficient at producing such environments near their residences and in agricultural settings. Here are some examples. So bird baths, which many people have near their homes, are great at collecting rainwater and creating a stagnant environment that is ideal for the development of mosquito larvae. Standing water and clogged gutters is another potential habitat that mosquitoes can exploit. Discarded automobile tires that are great at collecting rainwater are also very important sources of mosquito larval habitat. And any type of farm or yard equipment that could collect rainwater, such as the wheelbarrows shown here, or general trash and debris left around a house, can serve as a potential habitat for mosquitoes. Some other examples would include feeding or drinking troughs for animals, kiddie pools or toys left out in yards, poor drainage on properties, and even the water and sewer systems are all fair game for mosquitoes to potentially lay their eggs and develop. Thus, it's very challenging to control mosquitoes since there are so many potential aquatic habitats for them to develop in. It's also why when natural disasters strike, such as hurricanes or floods, it can lead to explosions of mosquito populations, because once those floodwaters or rainwaters recede, you're left with pools of standing water that mosquitoes can exploit as a habitat. Well, that concludes what I wanted to discuss about the aquatic life stages, that is the eggs, larvae, and pupae. Now I'd like to focus on the adults, which, as mentioned earlier, are the terrestrial flying life stages, and probably the life stages you're most familiar with. Now, the transition from this aquatic pupal stage to the terrestrial adult is quite striking and dramatic to observe. This slide shows you some time-elapsed images of a mosquito emerging from this aquatic pupal stage to the terrestrial adult stage. And what the mosquito does when it's ready to emerge is to start inflating itself with air, which allows it to rise out of the water, and then the mosquito can pull itself out of that pupal case and will eventually fly off the water surface. And I'll show you a video clip here, which is pretty neat, showing you how the pupae pulls itself out of the aquatic nursery to the terrestrial environment.
After 3 or 4 days of acting goofy and tumbling around, a full-grown mosquito is ready to break out. To do this, the pupa finds a quiet spot and begins to swallow air, lots of air, like blowing up a balloon. And just like a balloon popping, the pupal skin splits open along the top, allowing the full-grown adult mosquito to crawl out. The head comes out first, followed by the wings and the antenna. Next, the 6 legs tucked under the body unfold. The whole process only takes about 5 minutes.
Once adult mosquitoes have emerged, both males and females will feed on plant nectars as a source of carbohydrates, which helps fuel the energetic needs for flight. This is a somewhat underappreciated aspect of mosquito biology because we often tend to put most of our focus on blood feeding. But without those carbohydrates found in plant nectars, it would be more challenging for mosquitoes to find vertebrate hosts to feed upon and may not allow them to invest as much resources into reproduction from a blood meal. Now, as I mentioned earlier, adult females are the only life stage of mosquitoes that feeds on the blood of vertebrates, and they require this blood meal to acquire the nutrients needed to properly develop their eggs and successfully reproduce. The mosquito species that require blood meals to successfully reproduce are referred to as anautogynous. And it is because of this need for blood that makes mosquitoes able to cause annoyance and serve as a nuisance for animals and humans, as well as allows them to transmit deadly diseases, which we're going to learn about in the next learning goal. And I wanted to point out, as these pictures below illustrate, that no terrestrial vertebrates really get a break from being fed upon by mosquitoes. Amphibians are fair game, as well as reptiles and birds. We tend to think of ourselves and mammals as being the primary source of mosquito blood meals, but other vertebrates are also exploited. And some mosquito species can be quite specific in the types of vertebrate hosts that they feed upon. For instance, the mosquito that transmits Zika virus is highly specific for feeding upon humans, which is one of the reasons why it is such an important disease vector. Now, although mosquitoes are most notorious for being blood feeders, it is a misconception that all mosquito species feed on blood. Some species are able to acquire enough nutrients during their larval stage that it can carry them through their entire adult life, and they do not have a need for blood feeding. In some cases, they have not even evolved the mouth parts that would allow them to blood feed. Now, these types of mosquitoes that do not require a blood meal to reproduce are referred to as autogenous, in contrast to anautogynous. And probably the best known example of an autogenous mosquito is the elephant mosquito, also known as Toxorhynchites. As its name suggests, the elephant mosquito is one of the largest mosquito species on Earth. Its body length can exceed 7 millimeters, and the fourth instar larvae of this species can exceed 2 centimeters in body length. So these are quite sizable mosquitoes. And this picture on the right shows you the fourth instar larvae of two different mosquitoes species. The one on the right, indicated by the white arrow, is that of an elephant mosquito, and the one on the left is a culicine species. Now, ironically, the way that this mosquito acquires enough nutrients and can grow to such big size is through the predation on other mosquito species. So this shows you a larva of an elephant mosquito feeding on another species. And I'm going to show you a short video clip of these Toxorhynchites elephant mosquitoes, of their larvae feeding on another mosquito. That video clip brings us to the end of the mosquito life cycle and learning goal number 2. However, before we move on to learning goal number 3, I wanted to share with you a video about the mosquito life cycle that distills everything we've talked about in the last 20 minutes into about 3 minutes. So please take a look at this, and then we'll move on to learning goal number 3.
Mosquitoes go through 4 stages of development in their lives. They undergo complete metamorphosis. Culex mosquitoes lay their eggs on the surface of fresh water, or in areas that will be temporarily wet, like floodplains. The eggs float alone, or in groups that look like rafts. Eggs laid during winter can survive to hatch in the spring. Mosquito eggs hatch into larvae. The larvae live at the surface of the water and breathe through a tube. As the larvae grow, they shed their skin a few times. If mosquito larvae need to hide from predators, they can swim and dive below the water's surface. Mosquito larvae live a few days to a few weeks before they turn into pupae. They stop feeding just before they turn into pupae. The pupae live at the water's surface and breathe through two small tubes. Mosquito pupae do not eat, but they are active. They tumble below the surface of the water when disturbed. They remain in the pupal stage anywhere from 1 to a few days, depending on the water temperature. While inside the pupa, the larva transforms into an adult. The adult breaks out of the pupal case and crawls onto the surface of the water. It rests while its exoskeleton hardens. Later, it crawls to a safe place out of the water and spreads its wings out to dry to prepare for life on land. The mosquito is now a flying land insect. Adult mosquitoes mate to produce eggs for the next generation. Adult female mosquitoes can live from many days to weeks, while adult male mosquitoes usually live just a few days after they mate.
And that concludes learning goal number 2, what is interesting about the biology of mosquitoes. Please continue to learning goal number 3, and we will discuss the veterinary importance of mosquitoes.